turned 80 last year, and I now have another 80 years working for common justice. That Dr. King cared about. I'm going to talk about marching because the civil rights movement for the last 50 years really has been a series of marches, many of which you probably don't know about. I'm going to try to do a little education while I'm here. Tommy has already talked about the importance of this event. I'm going to come back to it, but I just can't start without mentioning that I was at the march in Washington in 1963 that was led by Dr. King and other clients of mine like John Lewis, who was then the head of SNCC, and now a distinguished member of Congress, a long-time member of Congress in Georgia. Got his head beat in, fractured skull by starting off the summer march. Marches go through the movement. And I heard Dr. King give his I Have a Dream speech. And it brings me close to crying and breaking down when I realize how he would have felt to be here next Tuesday when the dream begins to be realized. I'll be back in Washington, there, which is where I live now. I'll go back tomorrow to be there to greet our new president, Barack Obama. And it's going to be a marvelous Before the March on Washington, there was a man by the name of Medgar Evers who worked in Mississippi. Medgar and his brother had both served in the armed forces during the Second World War. My wife has just finished a book about the Second World War, celebrating her father's efforts in that war. So we've been close to the war, but Medgar came back from the war deciding he wanted to be a law enforcement person. He wanted to be a sheriff or a police officer. He just felt he liked the uniform, he liked what he had done in the military. He got back to Mississippi and discovered he couldn't be any of those things. They told him, we don't take black people to be police officers or sheriffs. That was pretty upsetting for him, and so he joined the movement. He contacted the NAACP, and he became the state director of the NAACP in Jackson, Mississippi. And in 1963, in the spring of 1963, Medgar was shot and killed coming home from work one night, right outside his house. His wife, Merle, actually heard the shots and came outside and found her husband had passed away. A great lady, by the way, Merle Evers. 2 days after after his funeral, there was a march down North Farrar Street. My office was on North Farrar Street. North Farrar Street was the movement street in Jackson, Mississippi. Corps office was there, the SNCC office, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, our law office, and so on. It got a little out of hand. Fortunately, Dave Dennis, who was the field director of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality in Mississippi, and later my partner when we had a small law practice in New Orleans training young black lawyers. Dave was one of my partners. Dave came out together with some people from the Department of Justice and quieted the crowd down, and it all came out to a peaceful end. But that sort of triggered the thoughts of people. We've got to really march and let people know what's going on. And Dr. King and others organized a march on Washington, which resulted in 250,000 people marching down. The same kind of march that's going to happen on Tuesday. Same street is going to be marched on Tuesday that Dr. King marched in 1963. At the end of that march, it was so inspirational, not only to the people who were there, but to the civil rights leadership themselves, that was born the idea to have the following summer become Freedom Summer. Let's let the world know what's going on. And the movement had been going on for some time. The Greensboro, North Carolina, college students were sitting in at lunch counters in the 50s. They had the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks in the 50s. Dr. King was involved in that. But there was no really huge focused effort, and they decided to focus on the summer of '64, bring lots of people down south, and have a freedom summer, have young college students doing freedom schools, teaching young African-American kids the stuff that they couldn't get in their segregated schools. Schools were still segregated in spite of the Supreme Court's decision. And then they realized that what happens when the reaction, which was expected from the states of arresting people and harassing people, there were very few lawyers. In Mississippi, there were 3 black lawyers in the state of Mississippi when I got there in 1950. A state that had a population of just under 1 million black people had 3 black lawyers. There were 2 white lawyers who handled civil rights cases, but they had been forced out of the state by the time I got there. And they were driven out of the state. There were a few more than that in Alabama and Louisiana and Georgia, but the need was great. And so the leadership of all the civil rights and human rights organizations got together and organized something called the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee. The leader in the group was the ACLU, frankly, the American Civil Liberties Union, but others were involved too, the NAACP, Dr. King's group, CORE, SNCC, American Jewish Committee, the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice, and so on. National Council of Churches was an active participant in it. And they formed this group to be, just for the summer of 1964, they thought, to just have volunteer lawyers come down, spend your vacation in Mississippi. That's what I read. I had been involved in civil rights work before that in New York, where I was practicing. I was representing the Congress of Racial Equality in New York for a number of years, going back into the 50s. But I decided to volunteer I was getting a little fed up with private practice in New York. I volunteered for 2 weeks and stayed for 4 years. It was a life-changing experience for me. I started out first, instead of sending me to Mississippi where I had some experience, they asked me to go to St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine, Florida is the oldest city in America. They were getting ready in 1964 to celebrate their 400th anniversary in 1965. They were getting a lot of federal money to fund this big celebration. And then the black leadership in St. Augustine realized that they're getting federal money to run this thing and they won't allow black people to participate. You couldn't, I mean, they'll let them march, but there was not a single motel, restaurant in St. Augustine would serve black people in 1964. Not a one, other than the black-owned restaurants in the black section of town. So they began to demonstrate about this and invited Dr. King to come. It was led by an African-American dentist by the name of Robert Hailing, a great hero, still alive, or not very well these days. A young man like me, he's in his 80s. But he led this movement and got Dr. King to come down. And Dr. King began nightly marches from the black section of town, Lincolnville, down to the old slave market. St. Augustine is a port city. The ships used to come in from Africa that sell slaves on this dock down there. And they marched down there, but not without interference. There was a group called the Ancient City Gun Club, which was just another name for the Ku Klux Klan. Led by, and I love this, led by a pig farmer named Horse Manussi. And let me tell you, this man was a world-class pig himself. And they would hassle the marchers and throw things at them and jump on them, beat them up and so on. And occasionally the marchers were arrested. And the first time I met Dr. King was in early summer of 1964. I met him at the county jail in St. Augustine. I was getting him out of jail. He had been arrested that day together with 72-year-old Mrs. Peabody, the mother of the governor of Massachusetts, who had been arrested that day. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. That got a lot of press too. And so that was the first time I met Dr. King, and we left the jail, went back into Lincolnville to the Baptist church there, which was the church where the civil rights movement met every night after an event. I'll never forget this. Dr. King spoke a few minutes, and then we sang "We Shall Overcome," holding hands together. And it was a very moving, and it was that was the moment when I realized I couldn't go back to the regular practice of law, that I was going to come back. And so I went back to New York and met with the leadership of this organization. I said, you can't stop. You've raised expectations. There are pending cases, hundreds of pending cases. And I'll go back, and I'm going to have to get paid. I had 3 small children at the time who were living with my former wife in upstate New York in a school we started. And I said, you know, but we've got to keep doing it. And so they agreed. And we had some meetings into the fall. And in November, I went back to Mississippi. And by the 1st of January 1965, I'd opened offices in Jackson, Mississippi, Selma, Alabama, and New Orleans, Louisiana. We had paid staff lawyers in each of those states. I was the staff director overall. But we still used volunteer lawyers. We had 650 lawyers come through between fall of 1964 and when we closed up shop in 1971, when we figured we were no longer needed down there. There were enough local lawyers willing to do the civil rights work.